With Butch's masterminding, they continued to prosper. The Denver and Rio Grande Railway, $8,000. The Colorado and Southern, $45,000. The Union Pacific, $55,000. The Union Pacific responded by forming a special train-borne posse, transporting horses in a baggage car. About this time, Butch started working more closely with Harvey Longabaugh, known as the Sundance Kid. They shared a wry sense of humor. One day, after a particularly good haul, Butch and Sundance posed for a family portrait with the rest of the gang. It was a joke that would backfire and force them to flee the country. Sporting store-bought clothes and new derbies were Cool Killer Harvey Logan, Polecat Bill Carver, and Butch's pal, Sundance. Butch could barely suppress a grin at what he thought was a private joke. However, the proud photographer displayed the picture in his window, where it was spotted the next day by an amazed but delighted Pinkerton detective who spread the alarm. Hearing this and sensing their luck had run out, the bandits bought tickets on the very trains they once robbed. An elegantly attired trio, Butch, Sundance, and his girl, the beautiful Etta Place, headed for South America by way of New York. The big city in 1902 must have been a dazzling sight to these now rich but still countrified Westerners. They mingled with the elite on Fifth Avenue, and Sundance and Etta had their portraits taken at a fashionable salon. With queenly grace, Etta proudly displayed a new and expensive gold watch. A few weeks later, the trio sailed for South America. In Argentina, they worked as cattlemen until they were tracked down by a Pinkerton detective. Once more on the run, they returned to a life of crime throughout Chile, Bolivia, and Uruguay. In 1909, the story got out that Butch and Sundance were dead, killed in a gunfight in Mercedes, Uruguay. The Pinkerton agency eagerly accepted the story and closed the files on an old and frustrating case. But our research in Mercedes revealed no evidence that such a gunfight ever took place. Butch and Sundance's death a hoax? Perhaps still another way to outdistance pursuers? One day in 1924, 15 years after the alleged gunfight, a lone figure was seen driving up a Wyoming road. As he came closer, he seemed somehow familiar. Could it have been Butch Cassidy returning home after all those years? Many believe Butch Cassidy returned long after he was supposed to have died in a South American gunfight.
Old Butch wasn't killed in South America. He came back here in 24, and my grandmother seen him and talked to him. So I know he was here. He stayed a day and a half and then left, but he was here and talked to everybody.
He come back from there and went down in Utah. He stopped in Bags one night.
He went up to some of these old places and visited before he left. So I know he's here in 24.
One can only imagine what might have gone through his mind if he had revisited the places of his raucous youth. Most of his companions were gone. Harvey Logan, dead in a gunfight with a posse. Ben Kilpatrick, killed attempting to rob a train. Bill Carver, outdrawn by a sheriff in Texas. And the ladies who danced had vanished or settled down. Only memories remained. The memories live on in Bags. Recollections of those still alive who remember Butch's nostalgic homecoming. In an old house on the outskirts of town lives a man who was a contemporary of Butch Cassidy's. Now, Alfred Brazel is surrounded by his animals and his memories. The dates he gives might be questioned, but he is positive about what he saw.
He was not killed because in 1916, as sure as I ever stand right here, that I seen him right here in this store. I seen him with my own eyes. Now, Butch had 3 pack horses and 1 saddle horse. They were tied right out right at the side of the store. And he said, Ed, that I want you to go and get me 3 or 4 quarts of whiskey. Ed says, why don't you do it? No, he said, I want you to go get it. And Ed only had to just step out at the door and go about 50 feet to the saloon. I'd seen him before. It wasn't the first time I'd seen Butch.
Author-historian John Rolfe Burroughs has interviewed others who were even closer to Butch.
I came through here in 1959 researching a story on the Wild Bunch. Among other people I talked to was Tom Vernon. Tom at that time was 80 years of age, but his mind was just as clear as a bell. And among other comments I happened to make at that time was that I had read an article by Arthur Chapman to the effect that Butch Cassidy had been killed in Bolivia, in South America. Tom looked me in the eye and he said, killed in Bolivia? He said, Butch came through here in the early 20s and stayed with me 2 days. We talked over the old times, said there's no mistake. I knew every one of the Wild Bunch well.
Now, an expert historian has found evidence placing Butch Cassidy in this building in the early 1920s. John Burroughs has still more support for his conclusion.
I met a man in Rock Springs by the name of John Taylor who had known Butch Cassidy when Butch Cassidy worked in a butcher shop in Rock Springs, and that's where Butch incidentally got his nickname. Mr. Taylor owned the Ford agency in Rock Springs, and he said one day he was out in the shop, and here came a Model T, and it was Butch Cassidy. This was in the early 1920s. He said Butch didn't recognize him and didn't say anything, but he said there was no mistake, that he knew him well. Another person who saw Butch after he returned from Bolivia, who knew him very well, was Josephine Bassett Morris. She was his girlfriend.
In an old log cabin where she lived alone, Josephine Bassett talked with Burroughs in 1965. Still showing signs of the beautiful girl she had been, Josephine told him that one night in the early 1920s in Rock Springs, Wyoming, Butch and his old friend Elza Lay knocked on her door.
Said they were both a little out of condition, but we sat around and had a few drinks and reminisced about the old times.
Josephine said that was the last time she saw Butch alive.